The airport was alive with movement. People rushed from one place to another, some excited, some tired, and others lost in their own world. Among them, a woman in a crisp military uniform walked with steady steps. Her name was Captain Maya Richardson. She carried a single duffel bag over her shoulder, her grip firm, but her body was exhausted. She had been away for too long, months of duty in a land far from home. The air was heavy with the scent of coffee, perfume, and distant voices announcing flight schedules. But Maya's mind was elsewhere. She had seen things most people never would. She had heard sounds that still echoed in her sleep, yet she carried it all inside, standing tall as she approached the gate. She was finally going home. Maya took a deep breath and glanced at her boarding pass. First class, seat 3A. A small smile touched her lips. She had booked it herself. It was not a gift, not charity, just something she had earned. After sleeping in tents and bunkers for months, she looked forward to a few hours of comfort. The announcement came, calling first-class passengers to board. She stepped forward, handed over her ticket, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was quiet, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the rustling of newspapers. Comfortable leather seats stretched out before her, each one wide and luxurious. A few people glanced her way, some offering polite nods, others barely noticing her presence. She moved through the aisle, counting the seats. Then she stopped. A man was sitting in 3A. Maya's brows furrowed slightly. Maybe he had made a mistake. That happened sometimes. She took a step closer. The man was in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. He had an expensive leather briefcase beside him and a tablet in his hands, scrolling through something important. He looked comfortable, settled, as if this was where he belonged. Maya cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir. I think you're in my seat." The man barely glanced up. His eyes flickered to her uniform for a brief second before returning to his tablet. "I don't think so," he said simply, his voice calm but dismissive. Maya remained polite. "I believe this is seat 3A, she said, holding up her boarding pass. He sighed, finally setting down his tablet. He looked at her properly this time, his eyes scanning her face, her uniform, the bag on her shoulder. There was something unreadable in his expression. Then he let out a small, short laugh. "There must be some mistake," he said, shaking his head slightly. Maya's fingers tightened around her boarding pass, but her face remained calm. "No mistake," she said evenly. "This is my assigned seat." The man exhaled, glancing at the seat number above. Then he turned back to her. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as if explaining something simple. "I paid for this seat. I fly this route all the time. First class is, well, it's usually for certain types of people." Maya felt the words settle in the space between them. There it was. Her posture remained strong, her face unreadable. She had met men like him before. She had heard words like these in different ways, different tones. She had faced worse. A flight attendant appeared, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Maya turned to her calmly. "I believe there's a misunderstanding. This is my seat." The attendant glanced at Maya's ticket, then at the man. Her smile remained professional, but her tone was firm. "Sir, I'm afraid she is correct. Seat 3A is hers." The man let out another breath, shaking his head. Unbelievable. He turned back to Maya. "You people are always expecting something, aren't you?" A few passengers in nearby seats turned their heads. The air felt heavier. Maya stood there for a moment, the weight of 100 memories pressing down on her. The long nights, the cold winds, the fear, the sacrifice. And now, here she was, being questioned over something as simple as a seat she had rightfully booked. She could have argued. She could have demanded. She could have fought back with words, proving a point. But instead, she did something no one expected. She smiled. A slow, knowing smile, one that held 1,000 unsaid things. Then, in a calm, steady voice, she said, "All right, enjoy the seat." And with that, she turned and walked toward the back of the plane. Silence filled the cabin. The flight attendant opened her mouth as if to protest, but stopped. The passengers nearby watched, stunned. A young man in economy, Alex Carter, shook his head in disbelief. "That's not right," he muttered. Beside him, an older woman sighed. Some people don't realize what real class looks like. Meanwhile, in first class, the man sat back in his stolen seat, but he didn't feel as comfortable anymore. And before the plane even left the ground, a storm was already brewing in the sky. The silence in the first-class cabin felt heavy. The air, once filled with casual conversations and the sound of newspapers rustling, now carried an uneasy tension. People had seen what happened. They had heard the words. They had watched as the soldier, a woman who had given so much for her country, walked away without a fight. A man in the third row of first class lowered his newspaper. He had noticed everything. The way the older man had dismissed her, the way she had stood tall, and the way she had chosen to walk away rather than cause a scene. He shook his head slightly, adjusting his glasses. In the economy section, a young man named Alex Carter sat with his arms crossed. He had been watching too. He didn't like what he saw. His jaw clenched as he turned to the older woman beside him. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The woman, Margaret Hayes, gave a slow nod. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her hands resting on her lap. "I saw," she said, "and I'm not surprised." Alex frowned. She didn't deserve that. No, she didn't, Margaret agreed, but she handled it with grace. That's the difference between people like her and people like him. Up front, Thomas Caldwell, the man now sitting in seat 3A, shifted uncomfortably. He could feel eyes on him, though no one said anything. He picked up his tablet again, pretending to read, but the words on the screen blurred together. A flight attendant walked toward the cockpit, her steps quick, her face tense. The moment she entered, she spoke in a hushed voice to the captain. Captain James Wallace had been a pilot for over 20 years. He had seen all kinds of people on his flights, the kind, the rude, the quiet, the loud. But something about this situation unsettled him. He turned to his co-pilot, who had also been listening. "Did she really just give up her seat like that?" Captain Wallace asked. The flight attendant nodded. She didn't argue. She just walked away. The captain leaned back in his seat, thoughtful. Then, after a moment, he picked up the intercom. The soft chime of the announcement system echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we take off, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger on board." Passengers turned their heads, curiosity sparking. Captain Maya Richardson is with us today. She is a decorated soldier who has spent the last year in active duty, serving her country with honor and dedication. She has made sacrifices most of us can't even imagine. And today, she chose to step back with grace, but we won't let that stand. The cabin was completely silent now. Even Thomas lowered his tablet. Captain Wallace continued, his voice strong. "Captain Richardson, we would be honored if you accept the co-pilot's jump seat for this flight." For a moment, there was no sound. Then, slowly, heads turned toward the back of the plane, where Maya sat quietly in an economy seat. Maya looked up, startled. Her hands, which had been resting on her lap, tightened slightly. She wasn't expecting this. Passengers began murmuring, some smiling, some nodding in approval. A man in a business suit clapped, and soon others followed. The applause grew louder. People who had been silent before were now standing, clapping, showing their respect. Even the flight attendant smiled. Maya exhaled slowly. She wasn't used to attention like this. She had always believed that action spoke louder than words. But right now, in this moment, she felt something shift. A flight attendant approached her with a warm smile. "Captain Richardson, if you'd like to join the pilots in the cockpit, it would be our privilege." Maya stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. As she walked forward, the applause continued. Some people whispered, some just smiled, and others looked at her with admiration. When she reached the front of the plane, she caught a glimpse of Thomas Caldwell. He was staring at her, his face unreadable. She met his gaze for only a second before stepping into the cockpit. Inside, Captain Wallace turned to her with a respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, Captain." Maya smiled slightly. "Thank you." She took the jump seat, feeling more at home here than she had expected. The view from the cockpit was breathtaking, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the windows. Back in first class, Thomas let out a slow breath. He had never felt so small before. He shifted in his seat, the luxury of first class now feeling less comfortable. A flight attendant approached him. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" Thomas hesitated before shaking his head. "No, I'm fine." For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to say. The plane had taken off smoothly, rising into the sky like a great metal bird. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clatter of drink trays and the quiet murmur of conversations. But something was different now. The air inside the plane had shifted. It wasn't something people could see or touch, but they could feel it. It was in the way passengers glanced at each other, in the way they sat up a little straighter, in the way their voices carried a different tone. Everyone had witnessed what happened before takeoff. They had seen the quiet dignity of the soldier who had walked away from a first-class seat that was rightfully hers. They had heard the captain's announcement. And now, they couldn't stop thinking about it. In economy class, Alex Carter leaned back in his seat, his arms still crossed. He had been restless ever since Maya left for the cockpit. The whole thing didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about respect. Beside him, Margaret Hayes adjusted her blanket. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked, a knowing smile on her face. Alex sighed. "I just don't get it. How could that man act like that? And how could she just walk away without saying anything?" Margaret chuckled softly. "You're young," she said. "You think every battle needs to be fought with words. But sometimes silence is the most powerful answer." Alex frowned, staring out the window. "Maybe, but I still don't like it." In first class, Thomas Caldwell sat stiffly in his stolen seat. He had been expecting a peaceful flight, a few hours of comfort, a drink in his hand. But now he couldn't relax. The moment the captain had spoken Maya's name, something inside him had tightened. He had assumed she was just another person trying to take what didn't belong to her. But now, he realized, she belonged in that seat more than he ever did. The worst part was, nobody had called him out. Nobody had forced him to move or made a scene. And yet, he felt smaller than he ever had before. A flight attendant approached with a cart. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He hesitated. Normally, he would have asked for a glass of wine, something smooth to wash away the discomfort settling in his chest. But now, his throat felt dry for a different reason. "No, I'm fine," he muttered. The attendant gave a polite nod and moved on, but her eyes held something unspoken. Across the aisle, a man in his 40s, wearing a business suit, had been watching Thomas for a while. He had seen it all. The way Thomas had refused to move, the way Maya had walked away, the way the entire plane had reacted. And now he decided to speak. "Must feel strange," he said casually, taking a sip of his water. Thomas looked up, frowning. "What?" The man smiled slightly. "Sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to you." Thomas stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." The man shrugged. "You do." Thomas opened his mouth, ready to argue, but no words came out. Because deep down, he knew the man was right. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Maya sat quietly in the jump seat, gazing out at the endless stretch of sky. Captain Wallace glanced at her. "You all right, Captain?" Maya smiled faintly. I'm fine. Just wasn't expecting any of this. Wallace chuckled. Neither was I, but I couldn't just sit there and let it happen. Maya tilted her head slightly. Most people would. Wallace nodded, his hand steady on the controls. Maybe, but respect is earned, not given. And you've earned more than most of us ever will. Maya didn't say anything for a moment. She just watched the clouds drift past, feeling something inside her shift. Back in the cabin, people were still whispering. The older woman in economy, Margaret, pulled out a small notepad from her bag. She began writing something, her pen moving with careful strokes. Alex noticed and raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Margaret smiled. "A letter." "To who?" She glanced toward first class. "To someone who needs to read it." Alex watched as she folded the paper neatly, then waved over a flight attendant. She whispered something, handing over the note. The flight attendant nodded and walked away. A few moments later, the note was placed gently in front of Thomas Caldwell. He hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt thin, but the words written inside felt heavy. It read, "True class is not in where you sit, but in how you treat others. It's not too late to do the right thing." Thomas swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. Thomas Caldwell sat frozen in his seat, the small folded paper still in his hands. The words written inside echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. "True class is not in where you sit, but in how you treat others. It's not too late to do the right thing." He read the message again and again. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, a deep, uncomfortable feeling in his chest. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was something heavier. Shame. He glanced around. Passengers had returned to their own conversations, some flipping through magazines, some staring out the window. But he could still feel the weight of unspoken judgment. Someone had written this note. Someone had seen him for who he was in that moment. And they had decided to say something. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Had he really been so wrong? The memory of the moment played in his mind again. The soldier, Maya Richardson, had stood there, calm and composed, while he had dismissed her without a second thought. She could have argued. She could have made a scene. But instead, she had simply smiled and walked away. And then the pilot had made that announcement. The entire plane had applauded her, not him. That had stung the most. The world he knew had rules, unwritten but deeply understood. Power belonged to those who had it. Influence mattered. Wealth mattered. He had lived by these rules his entire life. But now, sitting in this seat that he no longer felt he deserved, he wondered if he had been playing by the wrong rules all along. A flight attendant passed by. He hesitated before stopping her. "Excuse me," he said quietly. She turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." His fingers tightened around the note. Can you take me to the cockpit?" The flight attendant blinked, surprised by the request. But after a moment, she nodded. "Follow me." As Thomas stood, a few nearby passengers glanced up, their eyes curious. He ignored them. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew one thing. He couldn't sit here any longer. The flight attendant led him through the narrow aisle, past the economy section, past the people who had seen his worst moment. He walked with his head slightly lower than before, feeling the shift in the air. Finally, they reached the front. The flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door. A second later, it opened, and Captain Wallace looked out. His brows lifted slightly when he saw Thomas. "Can I help you, sir?" Thomas cleared his throat. His voice felt strange when he spoke. I'd like to speak with Captain Richardson." Wallace studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, Maya sat in the jump seat, her posture relaxed, her eyes focused on the sky ahead. She turned when she heard the footsteps, her gaze meeting Thomas. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, Thomas exhaled and held out the note. "This was given to me," he said. Maya looked at the paper but didn't take it. I see. There was another pause. Thomas struggled to find the right words. He had never apologized like this before. He wasn't even sure where to begin. Finally, he sighed. I shouldn't have taken your seat. Maya studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. Why did you? The question caught him off guard. He had expected a simple acceptance of his apology, maybe even a nod of understanding. But she wasn't letting him off that easily. He swallowed. I don't know. Maya raised an eyebrow. You do. Thomas hesitated. The truth was uncomfortable. The truth was ugly. He lowered his head slightly. I assumed that you didn't belong there. Silence. Maya didn't react right away. She simply watched him, as if weighing his words. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. I appreciate your honesty, she said. Thomas met her gaze. You didn't say anything. You just walked away. Maya gave a small smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. Some fights aren't worth having. He frowned. But you deserved that seat. I know. Her calmness unsettled him. He had expected anger, or frustration, or even disappointment. But instead, she was steady, unshaken. It made him feel even smaller. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't know how to fix this. Maya studied him for a second before speaking. You can't fix the past, but you can decide who you want to be next time. Her words settled over him, sinking deep. For the first time in years, Thomas Caldwell felt something shift inside him. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, but for Thomas Caldwell, time seemed to slow. He stood inside the cockpit, facing Maya Richardson, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had expected this conversation to be easier. He had thought an apology, simple words, would be enough. But it wasn't. Maya had given him nothing more than calm, patient silence, forcing him to sit in the weight of his own actions. She had every right to be angry, every right to call him out. But she didn't. Instead, she had left him to battle himself. He took a deep breath. You're right, he admitted. I assumed things about you, things I shouldn't have. Maya didn't reply right away. She simply nodded, her gaze steady. I spent my whole life in rooms where people look like me, he continued. His voice was lower now, almost thoughtful. First-class seats, private clubs, meetings with people who think the same way. I never questioned it, never thought I had to. Maya leaned back slightly. And now? He let out a slow breath. Now, I'm questioning a lot of things. Captain Wallace watched from his seat, saying nothing. He was letting the moment unfold, letting Thomas wrestle with the weight of his own words. Maya, however, wasn't going to make it easy for him. She crossed her arms. You had a choice back there. You could have moved, but you didn't. Why? Thomas hesitated, then gave a small, bitter laugh. Because I thought I had the right to stay. Maya's gaze didn't waver. And now? His throat felt dry. Now, I'm not so sure. Maya nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Let me ask you something, Mr. Caldwell. He tensed slightly. If the roles had been reversed, she continued, and you were the one standing there while someone else refused to move for you, what would you have done? Thomas frowned. I don't know. Maya tilted her head. Would you have walked away as easily as I did? The question hit harder than he expected. He had always believed in standing his ground, in speaking up when something wasn't right. But in that moment, when he pictured himself in Maya's position, he wasn't sure if he would have been able to leave with the same quiet dignity. I don't think I could have, he admitted. Maya gave him a long look. Then, finally, she sighed and leaned forward. Do you know why I walked away? She asked. Thomas shook his head. Because I knew who I was, Maya said simply, and nothing you did or said was going to change that. Her words settled in the air between them. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He had always been a man who controlled situations, who decided how things would go. But here, in this moment, he wasn't in control. Maya had won the moment she had walked away. And the worst part, she hadn't needed to fight him to do it. Captain Wallace finally spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, if you want to do the right thing, now's your chance." Thomas looked at him. "What do you mean?" Wallace nodded toward the cabin. "Go back to your seat, the one you were assigned." Thomas hesitated. His seat in economy, the one he had thought he was too important for. He swallowed. It would be humiliating. People would see. People would talk. But wasn't that the point? Slowly, he nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cockpit. Thomas Caldwell stepped out of the cockpit, his steps slower than before. His mind was racing, but his body felt heavier, as if each step carried the weight of his own actions. The soft murmur of voices in the cabin filled the air, but something felt different now. The moment he emerged, a few heads turned. People had noticed. Some exchanged glances, while others simply watched. He felt their eyes. He felt their curiosity. And worst of all, he felt their judgment. His seat in first class was just a few steps away. It would have been so easy to return, to sink back into the comfort of luxury and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something inside him wouldn't let him. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to do the right thing. He let out a slow breath, turned his gaze toward economy, and began walking. At first, the movement felt small, just one man walking through the cabin. But the moment stretched longer than it should have, as if time itself had slowed down. A flight attendant standing near the divider hesitated when she saw him approaching. "Sir," she asked, uncertainty in her voice. Thomas stopped in front of her and took a deep breath. "I'd like to return to my assigned seat." The attendant blinked, surprised. For a second, she didn't know what to say. "Are you sure?" Thomas gave a small nod. The people sitting in first class looked on, some confused, others silently amused. They were used to things staying the way they were. First class was for those who belonged there. And now Thomas Caldwell, a man who had always claimed his space without question, was willingly giving it up. The attendant took a step back, then gestured toward economy. "Right this way." As Thomas walked past the curtain, the atmosphere shifted. People in economy noticed him immediately. Conversations died down. Some passengers sat up straighter. Others whispered. Even Alex Carter, the young man sitting near the window, frowned as he saw Thomas moving through the narrow aisle. "Is that?" He started, but Margaret Hayes, the older woman beside him, simply watched with a knowing expression. Thomas reached his row and paused for a moment. His seat was in the middle, between two strangers. He glanced at it, realizing how cramped it looked compared to the spacious first-class seat he had been in just moments ago. He let out a breath and sat down. The man in the aisle seat, a businessman in his 40s, glanced at him. "Didn't expect to see you here," he muttered. Thomas gave a small, tired smile. "Neither did I." Across the aisle, Alex leaned toward Margaret. "What just happened?" he whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. "A ripple," she said simply. Alex frowned. "A what?" Margaret turned to face him. "One small action can create waves," she explained. "People are watching. People are learning. And sometimes people change." Alex looked at Thomas again. He still didn't fully understand, but something about the moment stuck with him. Meanwhile, in first class, the empty seat where Thomas had been still sat untouched. A few passengers whispered about it. Some shook their heads. Others simply looked ahead, pretending not to care. But they had noticed, and they wouldn't forget. In the cockpit, Captain Wallace glanced at Maya, a small smirk on his lips. "Looks like you made an impact." Maya sighed, shaking her head. "It wasn't me. He made the choice himself." Wallace chuckled. "Maybe, but sometimes people just need to be shown the right path." Maya didn't reply right away. Instead, she gazed out the window at the endless stretch of sky. Somewhere out there, the world was still the same. Planes flew. Cities buzzed with life. People continued their routines. But in this one small space, something had shifted. And shifts like that had the power to change everything. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, steady and constant. Passengers had begun settling back into their routines, reading, watching movies, dozing off. But for Thomas Caldwell, everything still felt different. He sat in his cramped economy seat, his elbows slightly brushing the passengers beside him. The space was tight, the legroom almost non-existent, and the seat was far from comfortable. But for the first time, he didn't feel out of place. He had spent years believing that status and privilege were what defined a person. But now, as he sat among strangers, he realized how wrong he had been. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, glancing at him curiously. She had likely heard about what happened. Everyone had. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked politely. Thomas thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." She nodded and continued on her way. Across the aisle, Alex Carter stole another glance at Thomas before turning to Margaret Hayes. "I still don't get it," he admitted. "Why would someone like him leave first class to sit back here?" Margaret gave a knowing smile. "Because sometimes the right seat isn't the most comfortable one." Alex frowned. "But it's just a seat." Margaret shook her head. "No, dear, it's never just a seat. It's about what it represents." Alex thought about that for a moment. Maybe this was bigger than just a flight. Near the front of the plane, Maya Richardson had also heard about Thomas's decision. She hadn't seen him return to economy, but she had felt the shift in the atmosphere. She knew the feeling well. It was the same feeling she had experienced many times before. The quiet, powerful moment when someone realized the world was bigger than they had ever allowed themselves to see. The moment when change began. Captain Wallace chuckled beside her. "Bet you never thought you'd see that happen today." Maya smirked slightly. "Life surprises you sometimes." Wallace nodded, glancing at the controls. "You think it'll last?" Maya was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know, but I hope so." Back in economy, Thomas sat in silence, staring out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, soft and white like waves on an ocean. A part of him still felt unsettled. He knew that when this flight landed, he would return to the world he knew, a world of business meetings, high-end events, and luxury. Would this moment change him? Could it? He thought about Maya, about how she had handled everything with grace, never once losing her temper or demanding recognition. She had shown him something today, something he couldn't ignore. And maybe, just maybe, that lesson would stay with him long after the plane touched the ground.